Hello everyone. So today I'll be discussing the automatic expansion valve. It's AXV or AEV for short. I'll talk about what the valve actually is, where it's at in the refrigeration cycle, a few functions of what it can actually do, how it responds to load changes, what machines or applications it's used for, and some similarities between the TXV and the AXV. The expansion valve is the third element of the refrigeration cycle. It removes pressure from the liquid refrigerant to allow the expansion or change of a state from a liquid to a vapor in the evaporator. The high pressure liquid refrigerant entering the expansion valve is quite warm, while the liquid refrigerant leaving the expansion valve is quite cold. So here's a very simple picture of the refrigeration cycle. And all the four elements are in here. So the first one would be the compressor over here in your top left. And once the compressor leaves, it goes to the condenser. And during that process, it's high pressure gas. And heat is transferred from the refrigerant to the outside air. So once it hits to the condenser, it has high pressure liquid going into the expansion valve. So the condenser is right here in the bottom left. The fan right here goes to the dryer, which is kind of in the center, and then the expansion valve right here, which is kind of in the middle, in the top of the picture. So from there, the low pressure liquid goes into the evaporator, and heat is transferred from inside air to the refrigerant. So after it hits the evaporator, which is basically the heat sponge, the low pressure gas goes back into the compressor, and the cycle continues over and over. So you can see the evaporator right here as well, located in the blue, and it's going to go back. So yeah, it's a basic description of how the refrigeration cycle works. And like I said, the expansion valve is the third element on it, so now you know where it's at in this cycle. The automatic expansion valve has certain features to it. For example, it maintains a constant pressure in the evaporator. So the valve opens when the pressure drops. Another feature would be the spring pressure pushes to open the valve. Another one would be the evaporator pressure pushes to close the valve. And lastly, turning the adjustment screw onto the valve increases the spring pressure. Another thing to remember about automatic expansion valves is how different they react to load changes. For example, they act very, very different from the TXV load changes. So for one, it actually acts in reverse. Number two, when a load is added to the coil, the suction pressure starts to rise. And lastly, when the load is decreased and the suction pressure starts to fall, the AXV will start to open and feed more refrigerant into the coil. So one question you might ask is, where are these AXVs found? Like, what are they used for? What applications are they used for? So they're usually found in a smaller equipment with somewhat constant evaporator loads, including ice cream machines, freezers, ice makers, and drinking fountains. So here's a picture of a guy with a drinking fountain right here. So here are a few similarities and special considerations for the TXVs and the AEVs. The TXV and the AEV both are expansion devices that allow more or less refrigerant flow, depending on the load. They both need a storage device, aka a receiver, for refrigerant when it's not needed. The receiver is in a small tank located between the condenser and the expansion valve. Normally, the condenser is close to the receiver. It also has a king valve that functions as a service valve. This valve also stops the refrigerant from leaving the receiver when the low side of the system is serviced. And lastly, this receiver can serve both as a storage tank for different load conditions and as a tank into which refrigerant can be pumped when servicing the system. So this concludes my presentation on the automatic expansion valve. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how they work and where to find it, and how they actually differ from the TXVs and everything else. And here's one last picture of how an AXV looks like. Thank you, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.